Rabby, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 7, written by L. Muir, narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jenn McGuirk. Chapter 1. It wasn't easy to rouse the soldiers from their deathbeds in the middle of the day, and an oddly bright day it was. But Miss Sonseret had instructed Rabby to go say his goodbyes, and after knowing the men for 269 years and 2 months, he couldn't simply leave without a fare thee well, could he? He neared number 32, Leaf Lindsay, with a dread in his heart, for it was Leaf who sometimes awoke with half his face missing if he didn't take the time to right himself before moving about. But it was a frightening sight to look at a man and see what lay behind him at the same time, ghost or no. The man lay on his back near the right end of the Jacobite line where he served in Forfarshire's regiment. A black and red corner of his Rob Roy plaid waved in the wind, though it was a windless day. He blinked up at the sky with just the one eye, but quickly righted himself and rose to his feet as he sensed Rabby's approach. In the end, Rabby had no need to avert his gaze.
"Sir."
"Aye, Rabby."
"Dauphin and I are away then. Miss Sonny's come to call us on to some brave deed."
"Aye." The man frowned, and his gaze lifted in the direction of the car park, then returned.
"Look at ye, then. So important and grown up. You're needed before the rest of us."
He chucked Rabby under the chin and gave him a wink.
"Well, get on with your high and mighty self then. Canna keep the lass waiting, and when ye come face to face with that prince, ye give him one poke in the eye and a second in the snout. One for ye, and the other for Dauphin."
Rabby laughed along with him.
"I will that, sir, and Godspeed to ye as well."
Leaf nodded and patted Dauphin on the shoulder. Then he looked off, unseen, into the distance, fading as he did so.
"I'm content to wait until I'm called."
He was gone before he finished. It sunk in then. This was the last he would see of Culloden's 79, and Leaf Lindsay's imagined breeze sent a chill through him.
"High time I moved on,"
he told himself. Besides, it wasn't the same now with Fraser gone. He picked his way toward the next man having a lion, as many seemed to be doing that morning. To a man, the rest were pleasant. Each one had a kind word to say when he told them Sonny was there to fetch him and the dog away. But the sun, shining through their dimmed side of existence, cut their conversations short and sent many a man back to his muddy bed. Others wandered off in the direction of their thoughts, or made straight for Cameron, number 7. After bidding Rabby farewell, the tall man was warming up to the sound of his own voice, and once Cameron started speaking, he could never seem to stop until he'd told a great long tale. One yarn would lead to another, and then another, and so it would go until he got round to recounting the days leading up to the Battle of Moor, as their resting place used to be called. This was the part the other spirits enjoyed, because more often than not, in Cameron's telling, the war ended differently. Indeed, the truth was a stranger to Cameron most days, and it would be a foul-weathered evening or an evil moon that would dampen the tall one's humour and lure from his mouth the true version of that April morning. But with the sun shining brightly, the men were guaranteed a lively account that would no doubt end with the Scottish army driving the government troops south until every last one of them lost his footing and tripped off the white cliffs at Dover. Rabby reckoned by the time Cameron's voice grew strong, he'd have at least 70 of Culloden's 79 gathered close, in spite of Miss Sonny standing in their midst. Odd, that. Usually, when Sonny neared the moor, Every man was on his feet and alert, uncaring about weather, sunshine or no. Cameron himself would be shutting his gob and making note of where he'd left off, to take up his story again after the lass had gone. But perhaps, Rabby reasoned, the witch had come only for him that day, and the others were not invited to witness his going. It made him feel a wee special. But he was also disappointed the rest would be gathered around the bright bonfire, watching him step forward and volunteer. They'd not witness his brave face before he would be whisked away in dramatic fashion as the others had been. Rabby took a deep breath and let it go. It was enough that he would never again wake to see Leif's missing face, never need to put forth a brave air for Fraser, even though he was greeting inside. He'd never again feel the weight of Kennedy's secret on his mind or the secrets of others. On the morning after the battle, Rabby had been the first to heal many of them when they'd risen, and some hadn't been able to hide those secrets quickly enough from him. But he'd kept his lips tight and carried those confidences about like the satchel at his back. The responsibility had been heavy at times, and he would be glad to be rid of it. All those years, he'd reckoned it was that special duty that kept him there on the moor, keeping skeletons from escaping the cupboard, so to speak. But since summer solstice, the men had been in agreement that it was the thirst for revenge that had bound them together. He'd nodded along, of course, loath to lead any ghost into believing he didn't belong. But in truth, he didn't blame the prince, for he knew, good and well, the fault for his death on that battlefield lay at his own feet. Now that he had it from Fraser's mouth that there was nothing to fear by taking up Sonny's offer, he was anxious to get going. Although she'd promised he would not be facing a test, she would be sending him on an adventure nonetheless. If he truly did prove himself the heroic sort and win himself a boon, he hoped he'd be offered something much more gratifying than meeting with the prince. In fact, he wanted nothing more than what every 10-year-old boy wanted. Only after waiting all those years, he was sure he wanted it more than any other could. Chapter 2. It took purpose of thought to resist joining the other ghosts headed in Cameron's direction. If ever Rabby had heard a true siren's song, it was the tall man weaving tales of happier times, filled with victories and celebrating. But if he was a quick lad, he might be celebrating soon enough on his own. He found Sonny standing on the footpath with Kennedy to one side and a black-haired gentleman on the other wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Fraser, sadly, was nowhere to be seen. So apparently their farewell had been a final one, just as Sonny had said. He swallowed hard, forcing the truth into his belly. He was on his own now. His protector was gone. If Rabby was lucky, Fraser wouldn't be needed, but he would certainly be missed. As he neared the group, he tried to keep from looking at Kennedy directly. He was always afraid he might betray that one's secrets with just a glance, so he averted his gaze when others were about. He slowed to be sure he wasn't interrupting their conversation, but Sonny waved him forward. The look on her face boded bad news.
"Rabby lad,"
she said with a frown. Her hands twisted in front of her.
"You ken Kennedy, but this,"
she pointed to the man on her right,
"is my Uncle Wickham. We'll need his help today."
The man looked him in the eye, just as Sonny always did. Perhaps the ability to see spirits ran in their blood then. Rabby nodded to the man, but was greeted by an outstretched hand. He shook it firmly as Fraser had taught him, in theory, not practice. But it wasn't until he felt the warmth of her uncle's flesh that he realized he could feel. And what was more, the grinning man could feel him as well. "Cor!" Wickham chuckled.
Core, indeed.
Rabby held tight for a moment longer, but the man didn't seem to mind. Once he let go, he looked about for what might be missing. Then he had it.
Miss Sonny,
Hmm?
where's your lovely green circuit? That hoop of light that spins about you when you're sending the men away.
He tried not to sound too eager, but nothing about his challenge seemed to be unfolding as the others had.
Och, laddie, no great mystery there. The green ring is for protection. I need no protection while Wickham is near. Does that satisfy you?
He didn't know how to mask his disappointment.
I just...
Would prefer the bright light and the big fire.
He nodded, embarrassed she read his thoughts so easily.
Your wee adventure will be quite different from the rest, Rabby, but no less exciting. And you'll be extended the same boon, of course, if that's what you desire.
He bit his tongue to keep his own secret, then nodded. Sonny's frown returned.
I'm sorry to say, though, that Dauphin must remain behind for now.
His fingers clamped around a handful of thick black hair and held. Dauphin was the only thing he'd been able to feel through the centuries. It was a gift from God, it was, and grateful he'd been for the security he'd felt, and the chance to comfort the poor beastie that had been trapped on the moor by Rabby's own doing. To leave the dog behind seemed like an ungrateful thing to do. But after a moment's thought, he supposed part of proving his bravery entailed proving it alone.
I only worry about Dauphin,
he said, and gave the beast a pitying look, imagining how lonely he'd be without Rabby as a companion.
I've already thought of that,
Sonny said, and tipped her head toward Kennedy. With a single pat on the leg, Kennedy proved that Dauphin was not so particular as Rabby believed him to be, but no matter, it was better the dog stayed with someone familiar.
I'll be back,
he assured the mongrel. Sonny shook her head.
No, Rabby. You'll see Dauphin on the other side.
But Fraser came back.
Fraser had made special arrangements. I cannot do the same for you. And besides, I've no pixie dust in my pocket for the dog.
She must have read something desperate on his face, for she heaved a resigned sigh.
How about this? If you find yourself in need of Dauphin's help, Wickham here will ensure the animal can come to you. And if you've no need for him, he'll be waiting.
Waiting? You mean...
He gestured with his finger up and over.
Aye, on the other side,
Sonny said, then wrinkled her nose.
One last farewell, then.
Rabby chanced a glance at Kennedy. Though the tears in those eyes were phantoms, the tears in his own felt real enough. He stepped forward double time and wrapped his arms round Kennedy's waist and held them up as if they truly touched. Go with God, lad. A quiet whisper, and then number 55 began to fade, along with Dauphin.
Wait!
He dropped to his knees in front of the beast, and Dauphin's form returned.
He must be given a chance to say goodbye, mustn't he? He's needed me all these years. It would be a shock for him, sure, when I'm not there when he wakes. I must at least try to help him understand.
No one argued. He grabbed the sides of Dauphin's head and shook the fur, then scooted his hands up to ruffle his ears. The dog closed his eyes and relished the attention, but when those eyes opened again, they seemed to hold all the regret of the world.
Don't carry on so,
Rabby whispered. Sonny's hand came to rest on his shoulder.
Let him go, laddie. He understands.
Rabby nodded and climbed to his feet, and though it might have been his imagination, he thought the dog gave him a nod just before he faded completely. The thought that kept him from crumbling into a heap of tears was this: if the dog understood so well, perhaps he also understood how Rabby regretted luring him away from home that day so long ago. Chapter 3. Sonny made a noise in her throat.
Are you ready, Rabby?
He swallowed a bit of something lodged in his own windpipe, then swallowed again to be certain it was gone. Aye. She smiled warmly, nodded to Wickham, and stepped back. The man moved to face Rabby and held out his forearms with his hands open to the sky, bulging with veins and muscles they were. Push back your sleeves, laddie, he said. Bare your arms and take a hold of my own. Rabby did as he was told, pushed back the layers of loose clothing until his forearms were bare, pale and scrawny as they were. He laid those arms over Wickham's and gripped the thickest part of muscle, managing to wrap his fingers only halfway round them, amazed once again that his own ghostly limbs didn't pass straight through to the other side. Wickham's hand then took a firm hold of Rabby's arms just below the elbow, able to hold tight just as Sonny and Simon McLaren had been able to touch each other like true mortals. The man gave him a nod of approval, took a deep breath, then released it slowly. Rabby, he said quietly, hold tight until the end, aye. Dinna let go, no matter how strange you might feel. His insides trembled with apprehension, but he nodded just the same. Nothing to fear, Fraser had said. Nothing to fear. Good lad. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Sonny take another step backward off the footpath and onto the grass. He couldn't help wondering what she knew, but it was too late to question. Wickham gripped him tighter, and he was suddenly able to feel the pinch of it. After centuries of feeling no pain, the slight burst of it shocked him and forced his eyes shut, but still he held on. He felt other things as well. A wash of warmth flooded his ears, his head, and his neck. His chest rose and fell again. The coolness of the late morning air lit his lungs from inside and made him giddy. Scotland, a burst of taste in his nose, a sensation on his lips as he drew a breath over them. The salty tang of earth melted into his tongue, and he wondered how he'd ever forgotten the flavour in the first place. His stomach filled with teasing scents and grumbled from want of something more. He thought the onslaught was over and slit his eyes open to peek at the man concentrating before him. Wickham's brow twisted, his frown deepened, and his fingers bit deeper into Rabby's forearms. Rabby was tempted to let go, fearing what the man intended next. As if he read Rabby's thoughts, however, he loosened his hold slightly, and the bite of pain was gone. Still he held. The sensation of heat filled his hips and buttocks, then spread down into his thighs as if hot blood were pushing through his veins, forcing his puny muscles to accept and expand. Through those slitted eyelids, he watched the man before him grow shorter, as if he was sinking into the pavement. But it wasn't Wickham sinking, it was himself, growing. The man's grip hadn't lessened out of sympathy, but because Rabby's arms had increased in girth. No longer were his arms puny bones wrapped in a thin layer of muscle and even thinner layer of skin. They were nearly of a size with Wickham's, and still growing. His eyes opened wide, and he giggled at the ground as it moved away from him. But the voice wasn't his own. It was deeper, older. He cleared his throat to hear it again. Wickham's eyes flashed open, and one of his arms fell away, as if the magic spell was broken by the interruption. Rabby opened his mouth to apologize, but Wickham shook his head. It is done, Rabby, and we've arrived. Arrived? Rabby looked about him, still holding on to the man's arm, concerned that if the contact were broken, he might find himself small and scrawny again. But they hadn't gone anywhere. They still stood upon the moor, but it seemed as though many others had arrived as well, and in battle costume. Dromossy Field, Wickham said, his voice hushed with reverence. Do what you must, laddie, but remember, you cannot change the path of history, aye? If we could do such a thing, it would have been done already. Culloden's battlefield hadn't been called Drumossie in some time, neither had it been host to so many men, not since the battle. Rabby turned back to ask Wickham if Scotland was ready to fight again for the Reformation, but he found himself standing alone, his arms raised. But instead of holding two arms, he held the handle of a round wooden targe in one hand and a broadsword in the other. Wickham was gone. You there, a captain called out. Take this to Lieutenant Colonel Lochgarry, left front. He held out a folded bit of paper while he turned his attention back to his ledger. When Rabby only stirred, the man grunted in frustration. MacDonald's of Glengarry! He gestured to Rabby's knees, which were indeed still covered in MacDonald plaid. Though his father had fought with other MacDonalds, he and Rabby had come from Dalcross, very near Drumossie Moor. It was why his father had been able to go home for supplies while the armies were still gathering. But when he'd left home the second time, Rabby couldn't bear being abandoned yet again. They'd had only a few hours together. It hadn't been fair. So Rabby had found an excuse to follow. If you dunna ken the man's face, listen for a German accent, said the captain, and slapped a letter against Rabby's chest. Aye, Rabby said. He slid his sword into the scabbard he found around his waist, then took the missive and hurried away, toward the left, toward the bog, and if the battle of Culloden Moor was about to commence again, toward the doomed. 'Twas no recreation, no reenactment Rabby was witnessing. The odours were far too familiar to him, the last things he'd smelled in his mortal life. They were from long ago, of course, but there hadn't been many memories to replace them, no matter how much time had passed. The lingering taste of morning dew was fading quickly in the midday sun. The trampled moss and crushed heather left a pungent bite on the air, and the fragrance of gunpowder and oil pushed its way up his nose, trying to displace all else. Soon the taste of blood, char, and smoke would join in. There was no question. He was back. We've arrived, Wickham had said. Now Rabby understood. And he wasn't to change history. Not that he wasn't allowed to do it, but that it wasn't possible. Well, he wouldn't fash over history, but if he was standing on the moor, if the battle hadn't yet begun, and if others could see him and hear him as they would any mortal man, then there was definitely something he could change. And if he died to make that happen, so be it. He was due to leave this world soon in any case. Rabby knew he could make everything right again. He only needed to find his father, just as he had the first time he'd arrived on the battlefield, April 16th, 1746. He only had to keep on his current course. Chapter 4. Do what you must, Wickham had told him. Don't try to change history. But standing on the moors, as thousands of Highlanders lined up to face their sure deaths, how could he not at least give it a go? Surveying the lines on the field, his own desires suddenly paled in comparison. Who was he to worry about one man when so many needed to know what he knew? Someone shouted McGillivray's name and told him to return to the right flank. An older man shouted in answer. So that was the great leader who had led and inspired so many, or rather who would inspire so many men in a wee while. But if McGillivray knew the truth of what was about to happen, perhaps he could inspire them all to flee for their lives and live to fight another day. That wouldn't be meddling with history so much as postponing it, surely. Rabby stepped in front of the famous man as he was about to pass. "Colonel McGilvery, sir." The voice from his mouth sounded strange, as if he were plagued with a horrible illness that had set up camp in his throat. The important man glanced at the letter in Rabby's hand. "You have something for me?" Rabby shook his head. "'Tis for Gary." Another man spun on his heel. "Here." He took the letter, nodded to the colonel, and turned away again. McGilvery raised an impatient brow. "Sir," Rabby began again. "The bog." The man's sharp look cut him off. "I ken it, son. We will have to compensate. It's too late now. Just do your best for Scotland and trust that God knows what he's about, aye." He slapped Rabby on the shoulder, then stepped around him and was gone. Rabby opened his mouth, but no argument came out. How could he debate with the man? Who could question God? But still, he had to try. So he started after the colonel, who was high-stepping over the terrain in his hurry to return to the clan Chatton at the other end of the line. "Sir, I beg ye," Rabby called out, unconcerned with how weak he might appear. A shout rose up, and all eyes turned to a man mounted on a white horse. Guarded on both sides, the bonny prince moved forward, smiling down at Jacobites as he came, as if he believed the day would hand him another victory over the Hanoverians. But Rabby knew better. Someone grabbed Rabby's arm and pulled him out of the way, and the prince's horse stopped where he'd been standing. Hope jumped in his breast. The prince could stop the battle, and if he could, Robert MacDonald and thousands of others would live. He could spare them all. He summoned his courage and stepped forward, but the hand on his arm pulled him back again. "Easy, man. You'll not be allowed to bend the prince's ear now, will ye?" Rabby turned to argue, but found himself staring into the face of his beloved father, Robert James MacDonald, distiller of Dalcross. His father stared back with a twinkle in his eye and a laugh waiting to burst forth. "Da!" He wanted to fall on the man's neck and tell him all of what he'd endured on the moor since that horrible day. He wanted to warn the man what would soon happen here and leave the burden of changing history to someone older and wiser than he. But most of all, he wanted to assure his father that, even though he appeared to be a grown man, he was still young Rabby MacDonald, his own son. A son so hindered by his own guilt, he would still be afraid 300 years hence to see what God would do with him. "Come, son," his father said cheerfully. "Let's find about a something to quiet that belly of yours, and we'll find a good view for the wee stramash, aye." "Aye," Rabby whispered, his heart so full he could barely find a voice at all. Though Robert couldn't know who Rabby truly was, he'd called him son, and the sound of it nearly brought him to his knees. But falling to the ground wouldn't be as simple as it had been before he'd been given a tall, hulking body. He followed his da through the rows of Highlanders toward the front lines. They stopped next to a man who sat resting on the ground, nearly hidden from view by the others towering over him. He looked up at Robert expectantly. "Did you speak to him, Rabby?" Rabby jumped at the sound of his own name. It had been so long he'd forgotten that many called his father the same. "I spoke to the captain," his dad answered. "The captain was moved enough to speak to that Gary. He'll not hear it. Too late, he says. This lad tried to plead our case to McGilvery himself." He pointed a thumb at Rabby. "But they are resigned. I'm afraid our fate is sealed, my friend." Rabby peered closely at the second man climbing to his feet. Murdo, a swarthy man who had lived 5 cottages down the road in Dalcross. He had 2 wee boys and a very young wife that day last summer when he'd left with Rabby's father to join the fighting. When Robert returned home a few days before the battle, he'd been alone, and Rabby had assumed Murdo had been killed in one skirmish or another. There had never been time to ask, never been time for much at all. Rabby had awakened to find his father had come in the night and was already preparing to leave again. That was the moment it had all gone wrong. They'd argued. In silence, he'd helped his father pack what rations he could carry. The man had dawdled a bit to appease him, but soon he was bidding Rabby look after his mother and walking down the lane once more. His mother. His mother had been left to look after herself. Under the pretence of chasing down Dolphin, Rabby had run off to follow his father, his obedient hound running at his side. In his dreams, some nights, he'd been awakened by the sound of his mother calling him,
Rabby, to me, my lad, to me.
Even at that moment he could hear her, and he turned and looked about, just to be certain she wasn't calling from the edge of the field. What's your name? Murdo poked his fat finger into Rabby's targe. Rabby MacDonald, he said, still so distracted by his mother's voice that he'd almost forgotten his father was standing next to him. I'm blessed with the same name, said his da. The smile in his eyes held a strange glint that made Rabby wonder if the man might recognize something in him. That makes at least 3 of us on the field this day. He pointed toward a rise behind them to the west. Rabby's heart nearly stopped as he realized what the man meant. Though he dreaded what he would see, he turned and spied his smaller self standing where his father had bid him stay, his hand wrapped in Dolphin's thick black fur. His father dug in his satchel, pulled out a small bit of bannock, and handed it to Rabby. Eat this, laddie. I'm sorry there's not more, but I give the rest to my wee boy, who stands there with his dog. He waved to the boy. The boy waved back with a sad smile. Dinna mind the lad. He's a bit sore in the backside. Had to give him up for, you see. He ran away from home to follow me. Disobeyed. I had no choice, you ken. Rabby looked into his father's eyes and struggled to keep his own dry. I'm certain young Rabby kens it as well, sir. His father fished a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped at his nose. Aye, I believe he might at that. He's a right clever lad, my Rabby. Again, that twinkle in his eye led Rabby to believe the man knew, somehow, that his son was standing in both places, beside the dog and before him at that moment, chucking down the last bit of bannock, a bannock his own mother might have made. How lucky he'd been, had the others among Culloden's 79 been so blessed to see their families again, to taste again their own mother's cooking. Surely not. There was a sudden scrambling in the ranks behind them, and Rabby realized that he would not have much time with his father. The clouds over the sun had tricked him. It was not so close to midday after all. The Battle of Culloden Moor was about to begin in earnest again. Chapter 5. Damn Cameron, anyway. After all those stories, the details of the real battle had been lost to Rabby long ago. Oh, the folks inside the great visitor centre probably had it right, but since few of the ghosts ventured through those doors, Rabby had avoided them as well, and whatever truths lay beyond were lost to him. Too many mortals emerged from the building with tears on their cheeks. Rabby would have been foolish to go poking about, or at least he thought it would have been foolish to borrow trouble. But at that moment, standing close to the front lines, waiting for the battle to commence, he wished he would have been a bit braver in his spirit form. If he'd paid strict attention, he might know of some way to save his father. Hadn't that been the one thing in all the world he'd wished for? A chance to send his father home alive. The one thing that would make amends to his mother for running away and never returning. It had been his fault, all of it. If Dolphin hadn't been told to stay at Rabby's side on the rise, the animal might have been free to protect the elder Rabby. But now he realized, thanks to the magic of Wickham, he was able to stand at his father's side and defend the man himself. 78 warriors had taught him their best moves. He could manage this. The first belch of bagpipes with their discordant cries caught him by surprise and curdled the blood in his newly enlarged body. He took his sword from the scabbard and stepped back between his father's line and the one behind to wield the thing about and test the muscles that held up his manly form. His new body seemed to know its purpose well, for the sword sang through the air and sliced where he willed the blade to slice. He ducked and sprang forward, dodged to the left, then the right. He spun about in different directions and never lost his footing. Aye, the body would serve him well. The grown version of Rabby MacDonald the younger was a fit and agile man. But could one man make a difference? Murdo laughed. "A dandy fighter to be sure, but would you mind saving some of that fight for an actual enemy, or do you just dance?" "To me, Rabby," his father said, just as if he were calling him from across the yard or a field of barley. "To me, Rabby, my lad, to me." The skirl of pipes came from across the way, a reminder that Scots fought on the other side as well, a mean reminder that soured his belly and made his chest groan with hatred for all those who would fight against an English free Scotland. The deep murmur of voices around him said he wasn't alone in his sentiment, and that murmur grew into a rumble and then a roar. The sense of being part of something great and powerful was much more impressive from inside the ranks than it had been when he'd stood upon the rise that day. His chest swelled further with the knowledge that he shared that experience with his father, and in that moment he understood what had driven the man to leave his family for a time in order to be part of that great rebellion. It was no wonder he was in a hurry to join his comrades again, to not miss the fight. And how magnificent it might have been to have strode up the lane to his home and deliver that victory to his family. But there would be no victory. Rabby glanced about at the faces of those beside and behind him, stoic, determined, resolved, and yet resigned. Wickham had been right. History would not be changed that day. There was no sense raising a hue and cry to stop the butchery before it began. These men saw it coming. They knew the bog lay ahead. They knew there would be no victory. And yet they remained. His father remained. One look in the man's eyes, and Rabby knew there was no use urging the man to flee while he could. A mix of foolish and honourable were all the men of that company that day. When Rabby thought the tension could not stretch any further, the first shots were fired from the Jacobite artillery, such as it was. It was soon answered by the impressive guns of the redcoats. One heartbeat, then another, and still the order to charge did not come. A dozen more, still nothing. Rabby's legs shook from the effort it took to restrain himself, poised as he was to run, but still the order did not come. Boom after boom after boom sounded from the far side, and a great cloud of smoke rose from the far right, almost obscuring the end of the red line. Screams and cries rose from farther down, but where Rabby stood, the enemy was farther off, out of range from all but the biggest guns. Those guns didn't wait, of course, and still he and his father, along with the rest of Charles Stuart's army, held their ground and waited for the order to charge. More screams to the right, more cannons boomed and boomed again. Rifles fired. Men collapsed like birds picked off a tree by so many meanly thrown rocks. It wasn't long before Rabby understood just why Culloden's ghosts were so angry with their bonny prince. Why didn't he give the order? Had it been his plan to have them all line up to be shot? Had he never intended to do anything more than help the English government murder the rebels? It was almost easier to let his thoughts run wild than to listen to the horror unfold before him. The whistle of cannonballs, the cries of the wounded, and worse yet, the silence of the dead. Finally, there was movement at the right end. Just as Cameron often told it, the right line broke ranks. Fed up with waiting and watching their brothers die for naught, they charged forward, screaming their war cries, and making the blood of their ancestors boil with pride in the very ground beneath their feet. So many of them fell by musket fire, but still they charged, and the lines behind them. Surely the order to charge would come now, but it didn't. The middle line broke ranks next, and finally, the men around him surged forward. But the way was quite different for those at the left. The bog was saturated, sure footing was not to be had, and the pace slowed to little better than a crawl. Seeing their difficulty, the Hanoverians advanced and opened fire. Men died and remained upright, stuck so surely in the deep mud that only grew wetter with the addition of so much blood. Murdo fell to his knees, then onto his face in the mud, but never struggled to rise for a breath. By the time Rabby reached him, the man was still as a rock, but he couldn't waste worry for a dead man. He had a living father to protect. His own boots caught and dragged, but he pulled them free, refusing to allow his father to move forward without him. For long minutes they fought with the bog, and Rabby realized that even if they managed to find firm ground soon, all their energy would be spent. They'd be lucky if they could raise a sword, let alone find the momentum for a Highland charge. He had to get his father out of there. Surely at this point his father would find no dishonour in turning back. No sooner had he thought the words than a wave of redcoats charged toward the bog. Chapter 6. Time slowed, even as he watched his certain death, his second death, loom closer. A few clansmen had gotten through the mud and were finally free to engage the redcoats. At least those men had a chance, and they were buying the rest valuable time. His heart dared not hope for much of it. "Hurry, da," he said without thinking, but he realized the man had stopped moving altogether. A quick look at his face proved his father hadn't been wounded like he'd feared, but his left boot was well and goodly fixed in the mud. "Leave me," the man whispered. "Never," Rabby replied, and moved around behind his dad to pull his shoulders back, hoping a new angle would help free the foot, but the boot wouldn't budge. He glanced at the redcoats, still engaged, but the clansmen were falling. He remembered Cameron's account of the butcher teaching his soldiers a way to beat the Highland charge with nothing more than their bayonets, and it seemed as if Cameron hadn't been exaggerating. Rabby couldn't free his father and fight at the same time. He needed help. He ceased pulling on the man and turned to the west. It wouldn't be long now. The boy still stood on the rise with the dog at his side, but in a moment he would be dead, and a black beast with him. It had already happened long ago, or in a few moments, it would make no difference, but his father might be saved. The boy hadn't suffered, wouldn't suffer, and on the morrow, when he rose to haunt the battlefield, he would not be alone. I was never alone. He threw his head back and pled to the heavens. "Miss Sansaray, Mr. Wickham, hear me, I beg ye, send Dauphin." He ignored the enemy long enough to summon the dog. "To me, Dauphin, to me." Instantly, the black blur left the boy's side and shot straight down to the field and across the bog. And while he came, Rabby exchanged a look with his smaller self. Again, That sad smile. Rabby raised his hand and gestured for his younger self to go, to flee. Go! He cried, even though he knew the lad wouldn't truly be able to hear him, not like the dog had. Go! He waved again. But the boy shook his head, shrugged a shoulder as if to say, we both know how this has to end. Oh, aye, he did. But standing by while a child was cut down, what man or boy in man's clothing could do that? Wickham had warned him. One cannot change history. Had he been referring to his father's history, or his own? His attempt to warn the colonel that the battle could not be won had made no impact. One or two voices obviously could not change the minds of so many leaders, but surely he could change one outcome, else why had he been brought back to that battle? Could he save Robert MacDonald, or was he supposed to save himself? Would Dauphin be enough to save the man, while Rabby went back to save the lad? Could he take that chance? Chapter 7. Time was running out. The redcoats were now entering the bog. Apparently, the 24 shots they'd been allotted had been spent, and they intended to use their bayonets to good measure. With his da stuck as he was, all they could do was wait for the butchers to get close. He couldn't think of the lad on the rise any more. There would be no leaving his fallow. Wee Rabby had died soon after the government's left flank had advanced, and with them their large guns. Any moment now, a cannonball would sail far over the heads of the Jacobites struggling in the bog, and catch the younger him in the shoulder, killing him and the dog, while they still listened to the whistle of it coming their way. He could not spare even a glance behind him now. He would not risk the temptation of turning and running back to whisk the boy out of the way and send him running for home. He would not leave his father, even if the man were doomed. If only Sonny had given him more guidance, if only Wickham could have said more than simply, "Do what you must." Dauphin reached him then, but continued past him until he stood before Rabby's fallow, facing the enemy, forcing the first redcoat to back beyond the point where his sword could reach the man still struggling to free his foot from the muck. All growl and snappy jaws, Dauphin defended Robert as if the dog too had waited 269 years to redeem himself. He might have held off the whole of Cumberland's army alone, he was that vicious. Rabby took advantage of the distraction and hurried to help his father try again. He pulled his father's skein dhu from his sock and bent to cut the laces, to pull the foot free at least, but the mud gave up the boot with a wet kiss, and the man tumbled backward onto his arse. A redcoat advanced with his weapon gripped tight, his bayonet aimed at Robert's heart. Had Rabby not been there to protect him, his father would have been cut down. Was this how the man had died so long ago? Probably. But not today. He pressed forward and knocked the man back with his targe, then took a precious second to change hands, his targe into his right hand, and his broadsword into his left. The next redcoat trained to stab to his right, to take advantage of the usual vulnerability, found the targe blocking his way. The tip of his bayonet struck and embedded itself into the wood. While Rabby swung his blade to cut down the first man, still intent on killing his father, he kept the second one busy trying to dislodge his weapon. Before the first Englishman sank into the mud for an eternal rest, Rabby swung his left arm out behind, rose it above his head, then came down over the top of his targe to smite the second man in the heart. While he stood at the ready for the next wave of redcoats, his father scrambled out of the black mud, got to his feet, and poised his weapons. But no new threat came from the smoky fog beyond. A cannonball whistled high overhead, and they both turned with horror to see it explode on the rise, just where the boy had been standing. After a heart-wrenching denial, Rabby the elder struck out for the rise, but Rabby grabbed his arm and held him back. "Trust me," he told his da. "The boy is already dead and gone, but ye must flee, now. Rabby cannot go home to his mother now, but ye still can. This cause is lost. It was lost before it began. Now go." Anguish, mixed with something softer, twisted the man's tear-stained face. "But my boy—" Rabby shook his head. "I will tend to him. You must trust me. God will comfort him in your stead. Now go, so I may be comforted as well." The man stepped forward and clapped Rabby on the sides of his arms. "You made me proud, Rabby. You're a mighty warrior, son." Rabby swallowed the lump in his throat and pushed the man away. With tears flooding his face, his dad turned and ran to the far right, and while he ran, his head turned over and over toward that spot all too familiar to Rabby. The spot where he'd fallen so long ago. Yet again, his father was walking away and leaving him behind, but it was different then. Rabby wasn't watching him storm onto a battlefield, never to return. He was headed for safety and home, a chance to defend himself instead of being cut down while trapped in the bloody mud. And somewhere near Rabby's middle, his world righted itself. MacDonalds continued to be cut down, unable to charge, unable to retreat easily. A skirl of pipes lent false hope and false courage to those trying to make their way through the bog, hoping for a chance to fight the enemy hidden behind the smoke. The familiar feel of coarse black hair slipped between his hand and the targe, and he absently stroked the dog before looking down. "You should go home, Dauphin. Go with Da. Protect him. Live as you should have, aye." The dog blinked at him. He stretched an arm to point where his father had disappeared in the distance. "Go with him, Dauphin. Go." The dog blinked, licked his fingers, then stepped away, but he didn't go where he'd been told. He took a few steps to the east, toward the enemy, then looked back. Rabby smiled. "You want your own revenge, do ye?" The dog barked. "Away with you then, and good luck." The dog blinked at him once more, then took off like he'd been shot from a gun himself. The black blur disappeared into a thinning wall of smoke. A musket ball whizzed past Rabby's ear, a reminder that he too was still in mortal form. So he picked his way carefully around spots where moss was softening from the flow of blood. The dullness that clung to the moor long after winter ended had been replaced by a colourful carpet of various plaids, still wrapped around the bodies of the slain. The bright red splashes of blood would turn to brown soon enough, then disappear under the pink of summer heather and the thick green growth of new grass. English shouts at his back made him spin to face the fight, but the bog that had been the curse of the clansmen now cursed the enemy. Both parties forgot each other for the moment in the struggle to free themselves. None of them seemed to notice Rabby's retreat, so he turned away again, intent on reaching the wee version of himself. He flung his mind back through his memories and tried to recollect if he'd suffered. Had the feel of Dauphin at his side given him comfort? He couldn't recall much before he'd risen the next morning, but it worried him to think he'd taken away that bit of comfort by calling the dog forward. Brave, obedient Dauphin. He'd come to him as he always had, no matter if he'd been confused by the two different incarnations of himself. He'd been told to stay with Rabby, so strictly speaking, he hadn't disobeyed by leaving one to be at the side of the other. Clever, clever beast. And clever Sonny. A black line began where the hot cannonball had scorched the earth, but now that he was upon the spot, Rabby could see no sign of his fallen self, no bit of blood, no shred of plaid. He spun round and round, making certain he was standing in the right place. And yes, there was the stone that was almost square, there was the bit of softness, an indentation in the ground that nearly matched the shape of his body, and made a comfortable enough bed for him for nearly 300 years. Next to it a half-moon of thick grasses that Dauphin had preferred when they found their rest. This is the place, but where am I? Chapter 8. He turned to face the battlefield once more, expecting the redcoats to push through at any moment and find him, to kill him again. But still, none looked his way, and a familiar feeling came over him, a feeling of being unseen. A strong hand gripped his shoulder, and he started, then relaxed when he recognized Wickham, still dressed in jeans and a grey t-shirt. Rabby pointed to the empty spot that seemed to raise up to meet him. "Where is the lad?" He knew no better way to ask. The man shrugged. "You are the lad." Rabby picked up one boot and then the other, smaller now, as were his arms. The sword and targe lay on the ground beside him. They both appeared to be so much heavier than they'd felt a moment before. Hadn't he swung that broadsword over his head like an able-bodied man only moments ago? Fraser would have been proud of him. "We're all of us proud of ye, Rabby, as is your father, if you remember." Rabby couldn't help grinning. "Aye, he was that. And there are others, of course." Wickham pointed at the melee, and just then a soldier in bright green plaid turned to give him a wide grin and a tip of a cap. "Kennedy." "Yes, always been watching out for you, it seems." Rabby nodded, but kept his lips closed for fear of losing secrets. Kennedy sank back into another familiar resting place. "Seems as though you've proven yourself well and good, son," Wickham said, drawing his attention again. "Sonny will be waiting to award your boon." "My boon?" He was distracted by the sight of Culloden changing before him. Gone were the billows of smoke, and with them the bodies of the fallen. The skirl of the pipes was just a memory ringing in his ears, and to his left, there was no sign of his father or anyone else fleeing to safety. "Aye, your boon, lad. No doubt you're anxious to go give bonny Prince Charlie what for. After all, it wasn't an hour ago he failed to give the order to charge." Rabby considered. Aye, he understood the frustration with the prince like he'd never understood before, but he was back to feeling like a lad of 10 years, still wishing for the things lads his age wished for. "Would Miss Sonny mind much, do you think, if I didn't care to see the prince?" Wickham smiled and shook his head. "Then what would you like for your boon?" "I did have something else in mind before I was made into a man grown. Now it seems a childish thing to ask for, especially since I've been given the best gift of all." "And what's that?" "The chance to—" Tears had begun mobbing together in his throat, and he had to swallow them down in order to go on. "I saved my da in battle. I don't suppose you saw it." "I did indeed." The man slapped him on the back and nearly sent him tumbling, but it made his chest expand to think Wickham considered him hearty enough to handle such a blow. "And Dauphin was exceptionally brave as well, don't you think?" His hand reached for the dog out of habit, but when he felt nothing but air, he tucked his thumb in his belt. While they'd been talking, it seemed the pair of them had moved from the far west point of the battlefield back to the path that ran before the memorial cairn. Sonny waited for them. Rabby ran forward and wrapped his arms around her, happy he was still substantial enough to do so. "I saved my da," he told her. even though he suspected she already knew. Perhaps somewhere there had been a camera of sorts. After all, if Wickham could take him back in time, there was no reason he couldn't have taken a camera along.
Yes, I heard, and I couldn't be more proud of you, young Rabby.
She patted the sides of his shoulders.
So what is it to be?
No boon for me, Miss Sonny, and I thank ye.
She was taken aback.
No?
No.
He was simply too embarrassed to ask. She nodded, frowned, then searched the pockets of her great black robes. She grinned when she found something.
Well then, you might at least take these off my hands. I'm afraid they'll melt if someone doesn't eat them straight away.
She produced 2 great handfuls of sweets and chocolate bars, just like the ones he'd seen on advertisements for decades. A trip to the sweet shop was the very thing he'd been wishing for. He pulled his hands away and tucked them behind him, embarrassed.
Ye kenned it all along, did ye not? Me've been teasing me all the while.
Her smile never wavered.
Aye, I've kenned all along, and I could hardly wait to give them to you. A lucky thing you're still able to taste.
She held them out and waited until he took the treats. He tucked all but one into his satchel, then opened his first ever piece of chocolate. It was strangely smooth, with crispy bits of sweetness hidden within. Heaven, just as he'd imagined it would be. Sonny pointed to the wrapper.
That's my favourite.
And mine,
he said, before tucking in on another piece. Sonny laughed and exchanged a look with Wickham.
Take your time, Rabby. We'll wait until you've enjoyed them all.
The next bar was not so easy to swallow, remembering what would come next. He'd performed his brave deed, so now he would be moving on to God's judgment, and if God would judge him more strictly than his own mother would, he feared he would not fare well. Sonny gave him a sideways glance.
What troubles you, Rabby? What nonsense have you been worrying over? Did Fraser not tell you there's nothing to fear?
He forced himself to open the third package, knowing his time might be coming to an end, and not wishing anything to go to waste. He popped a few of the small bright candies into his mouth before answering. The sweetness nearly made him forget the question.
my mum will not have forgiven me for running away and following my dad to the battlefield.
He ate a few more.
And if she can't have forgiven me, I doubt God the Father will be much pleased with me either.
Sonny chuckled, then laughed.
I knew it had to be something like that. And though I can't pretend I know the mind of God, I can tell you that your mother has indeed forgiven you, Rabby. And if she can, surely God can too.
She gestured behind him, and he turned to see what appeared to be a large mirror with the sun reflecting in it. But that seemed unlikely, what with the clouds gathering to prepare for the afternoon's showers. Out of the bright light stepped a dark figure, none other than Dauphin himself, looking brushed and well-fed, a dapper dog to be sure. He took a few steps in Rabby's direction, his tail wagging with such might that it shook his whole body from side to side. But then he stopped, barked once, then stepped back to the light. There he stopped and waited. A hand reached down to pet the animal. It belonged to his father. Though the man stayed inside the bright doorway, his image was clear, as was the image of Rabby's mother standing beside him. Those tears were back in his throat, but he had no hope of being rid of them, so he simply forced his voice through.
Dauphin wants me to come, I reckon.
He glanced up at Sonny. She mussed his hair, then pulled him close and gave him a kiss on the forehead.
I reckon they all do.
He smiled tentatively at his mother. She grinned back and opened her arms. He nodded her way.
Bodes well for my forgiveness, aye.
Sonny nodded and smiled sadly.
And if God needs a little persuading,
He patted his half-full satchel and gave Sonny a wink. The young witch gasped, then laughed herself silly while Rabby stepped toward the lighted doorway. His smile faltered when he finally looked into his mother's eyes. Seeing her sweet and unconditional forgiveness was his undoing. If only he'd known. If only he'd trusted. He fairly howled as he greeted against his mother's breast, and when he paused for breath, he heard the unmistakable sniffle of a certain witch not too far behind. But he was far too busy to console Miss Sanseret, enfolded as he was in the welcoming embrace of his parents and one very happy dog. This has been Rabby, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 7, written by L. Muir, narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jenn McGuirk. Copyright 2015 by Leslie Muir Lytle. Production copyright by Leslie Muir Lytle.